Intellectuals as being cut off from the real world. Abstract thinkers living a cozy existence in their ivory towers. But with the advent of broadcasting, scholars became national celebrities. They became experts at using radio and television to preach their radical views about transforming Britain.
Love is wise, hatred is foolish.
I don't believe there's a feminist alive who wants to abolish femaleness.
In this film, we'll hear from political and economic thinkers who were united by one idea, that for the first time in history, they'd found the key to running a good society.
All citizens in Britain are, in effect, covered for all risks from the cradle to the grave.
Their conflicting, sometimes dangerous ideas defined Britain in the 20th century.
At the time, we believe in the abolition of money, we believe in the appropriation of all private property.
Should we allow governments to secure a better society? Or place our trust in the individual?
Prosperity has never been created by governments.
And the battle was so bitter, we can still feel its scars today.
How do you run a free society? You haven't been able to.
London is a statue to one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. He's slightly forgotten these days, but he was a truly revolutionary figure who burst out of the academy to try to transform British society. His name was Bertrand Russell. Russell was a pampered child of the Victorian era, born to a wealthy aristocratic family in 1872. The young Russell fell in love with philosophy and mathematics, as he explained when looking back on his life on the BBC's Face to Face.
What was it that first provided you with the incentive to become a mathematician?
My first lesson in mathematics I had from my brother, who started me on Euclid. And I thought it was lovely stuff I'd ever seen in my life. I didn't know there was anything so nice in the world.
At the start of the 20th century, Russell was a fellow of Cambridge University, where he lost himself in the complex, abstract world of mathematics and logic. He might have expected to end his days in relative obscurity as an academic. But in 1914, Russell's world changed forever.
What episode in your life led you to turn again from philosophy, to some extent, into social work and politics?
Oh, the First War. The First War made me think it just won't do to live in an ivory tower. This world is too bad, we must notice it. I went all over the place making speeches, and I did everything I could to help the conscientious objectors. I wrote about it everywhere where I could. No, I did everything I could think of to do.
Russell was kicked out of Cambridge and even jailed for his activism. But he discovered a new vocation.
We all deplore the rapidly growing feeling in America in favor of a nuclear war in the very near future.
He became a familiar face on British television, using the medium to campaign for peace.
Of course, Russell was a philosopher and an intellectual and one of the great public intellectuals of his time, and so what he said mattered. He was one of those people who grew more and more radical as he became older. Normally, it's the opposite.
His success as a public intellectual was due obviously to his intelligence on the one hand, but also to his mastery of English. He was somebody who never wrote an ugly sentence or spoke an ugly sentence. He was somebody for whom the English language was a plastic material that could be put to his own uses whenever he needed it.
The worst possibility is that human life may be extinguished, and it is a very real possibility, very real. And that is the worst. But assuming that doesn't happen, I can't bear the thought of many hundreds of millions of people dying in agony only and solely because the rulers of the world are stupid and wicked, and I can't bear it.
Russell encouraged intellectuals to move from the world of abstract thought into direct action. One person to follow Russell's lead was his friend, the economist John Maynard Keynes. The young Keynes rebelled against conventional society. He was happily and openly homosexual, with daring ideas about shaking up the staid British establishment. Keynes was part of the Bloomsbury Group, a circle of avant-garde intellectuals that included Russell and the novelist Virginia Woolf. But even amongst this high company, his genius stood out.
Maynard Keynes had the most extraordinary good mind, frightfully quick, terrifically quick, incisive, and also an imaginative way of looking at economics, which seems to be almost impossible, but he did.
Well, Keynes, I think, has fair claim to have changed the world. He changed the world, obviously, he changed the economic world fundamentally, because Keynesianism is a fundamental challenge to pretty much all that had gone before. But I think the historic significance of Keynes is about more than economic theory.
Like Russell, Keynes was deeply affected by the First World War, as he witnessed the tragic fate of the men who'd returned from the trenches. The government had promised a land fit for heroes, but in the 20s and 30s, Keynes could only see poverty and, above all, unemployment.
Unemployment represented waste and insecurity, a terrific amount of insecurity. People were much closer to the margins of life, and there was much less social security. So if you lost your job, your household was driven into poverty very, very quickly. To Keynes, that was not only a great moral crime, but it was unnecessary.
In 1936, Keynes published his General Theory, which overturned all previous economic thinking. It argued that governments should spend more, not less, during hard times to stimulate the economy.
It was a ray of hope for people at the time. It imparted a sense of urgency. And it was very exciting for young economists because it showed why the classical economics was wrong.
Keynes saw his instincts about the economy proved right during the Second World War. He called the conflict the Grand Experiment. If the state could spend on armaments in wartime, why couldn't it spend money to keep people out of poverty in peacetime?
That it cost us that much to make war for 2 weeks.
There is little moving footage of John Maynard Keynes, seen here on the left of the screen. But in 1939, Keynes made a landmark radio broadcast explaining his radical solution to unemployment.
It is not an exaggeration to say that the end of abnormal unemployment is in sight. And it isn't only the unemployed who will feel the difference. A great number besides will be taking home better money each week. And with the demand for efficient labor outrunning the supply, how much more comfortable and secure everyone will feel in his job. That the grand experiment has begun. If it works, if expenditure on armaments really does cure unemployment, I predict that we shall never go back all the way to the old state of affairs. Good may come out of evil. We may learn a trick or two which will come in useful when the day of peace comes.
And when the day of peace came, Keynes's economic policies were finally put into action. The Labour Party took power with a truly revolutionary manifesto. Clement Attlee's government set about creating a fresh vision for Britain.
Let's go forward into this fight in the spirit of William Blake. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall the sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land.
But Keynes's theories formed only one half of this new Jerusalem. Just as important were the social ideas of another, much more straight-laced economist. A former head of the London School of Economics, Sir William Beveridge was serious, abstemious, famous for taking a punishing cold bath every morning. He produced a government report infused with Victorian morality, proposing a social security scheme to combat want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. The plan was controversial, so the timid Beveridge had to sell it to the nation.
Sir William summarizes the points of his plan.
The report proposes, first, an all-in scheme, of social insurance, providing for all citizens and their families all the cash benefits needed for security. I hope that when you've been able to study the report in detail, you'll like it, that it'll get adopted, and that so we shall take the first step to security with freedom and responsibility. That is what we all desire.
Thank you, Sir William.
What Beveridge offered was a better life. Keynes offered security of employment. Beveridge offered security for all those periods when people weren't in employment. So it was a cradle-to-grave system of security.
It's time for the Longines Chronoscope, a presentation of the Longines Whitnall Watch Company.
The report flung this shy academic into the limelight. He even spread the gospel of his revolution to the capitalist heartland of America. In this 1952 interview, in front of some shameless product placement, Beveridge discussed his plan.
All citizens in Britain are in effect covered for all risks from the cradle to the grave. I think my wife put it from the womb to the tomb.
But what's most interesting is that Beveridge himself didn't like the phrase that's become most associated with him.
Been describing it. You have been talking about what we might call in this country a welfare state.
I never use the term welfare state. I believe in welfare, but I believe people ought to get their welfare by a cooperation between the state and themselves, and not from the state alone. What we give to people when they're unemployed or sick or retired is a bare minimum, just enough to keep body and soul together, but not enough for anybody really to be content with.
Well, what's to prevent a man from merely staying on the social unemployment insurance system forever?
Yeah, but nobody really will be content to do so. He always wants something more. He wants more than the bare minimum. Practically all people do.
Thank you very much, Lord Beveridge. Great pleasure.
It all seemed so hopeful. The New Jerusalem had finally come. The ideas of Keynes and Beveridge triumphed after the war. Britain had close to full employment, a national health service, free schooling for all. The old were given guaranteed pensions, and Victorian slums were cleared for new housing. The welfare state was supported by both Labour and the Conservatives, a time of national consensus after decades of chaos.
What happened with Keynesianism is it was married with centre-left politics, with a sense of commitment to the welfare state, to building the land fit for heroes that wasn't built after the First World War. And the Keynesian welfare state that dominated Western European politics in the quarter century after the Second World War was a seismic change because it regulated the market, but it also built a fair society. And that's what made it a remarkable political vehicle, not just an economic theory.
But there were rumblings of discontent, even in the midst of utopia. This New Jerusalem could only be achieved through a colossal expanse of the state. Bureaucracy and the public sector hugely increased in the post-war period. Critics feared Britain was becoming a nanny state. One thinker, disquieted by the spectre of government interference was Russian émigré and Oxford philosopher Isaiah Berlin.
But we're thinking, why these highly cultivated?
In the early 60s, Berlin appeared on a discussion program expressing his hatred of being told what to do.
How does it stand up intellectually?
I think I object to being treated like a child. I think I objected to not being reasoned with. I object to paternalism. Ultimately, I think what I object to is being treated like a schoolboy, being told for my own good that there are certain things to do, or being driven in a perfectly beneficent direction by a perfectly disinterested, pure-hearted body of anyway, like governments or manufacturers, doesn't matter which, even if you assume that they are pure-hearted men. This is exactly what the British Empire felt towards colored people in Africa. It's exactly what schoolmasters feel towards children. And it always leads to bad consequences in the end. It must.
Paternalism was very alien to Isaiah Berlin. He wanted people to be free to live their lives according to their own values and goals, even if that meant they ruined their lives or went to disaster or tragedy.
Berlin became an advocate of liberalism against political dogma, a belief that stemmed from his childhood when he'd witnessed the brutal convulsions of the Russian Revolution firsthand.
There was a man in the middle of a kind of lynching bee, very, very white, being dragged off by the crowd. He was one of these people apparently caught in some rooftop and was being dragged off to obviously a not very nice fate. And this is so awful that it made a permanent impression on me, and I've never recovered from it quite, and it's given me a personal distaste for violence, which nothing will ever come.
What Isaiah Berlin believed above all is that no individual or government should ever be confident that it knows the truth, and therefore all attempts to impose a magic solution on problems, be they communism or certain kinds of right-wing economic doctrinaire behavior, all these things we should be suspicious of, because no one knows the whole truth, and skepticism is the only wise position to adopt.
If you believe there is a single answer to a single question, the true answer, all the other answers being false, you see, and all these answers can be put together and harmonize with each other and create the perfect universe, then there is a temptation, if you think you have it, to do awful things.
This is a moment when the old order is crumbling, and people like Berlin, with his philosophy of liberalism, is really advancing what we now think of as the modern way of looking at things, which is leave people free to do as they please, so long as they don't harm anyone else.
Berlin thought repressing individualism would only lead to anarchy. And his worst nightmares seemed to come true in the angry decade of the 1960s.
I'm telling you, don't make me provoke you.
Students became a force for protest. And like Russell before them, they fought for change not only on the streets, but also on television.
What would you do without any students? The machine would not run, would it? People run? No, wouldn't run.
I don't agree with it at all. If they're so fed up with being students, they can get a job anywhere.
In the 60s, that was the mood. It was a mood created by full employment, by being very fed up with the boring, in this country, stale, tired, fuddy-duddy 50s.
A house which is divided against itself cannot stand. And what we've been talking about here today is the problem of racialism.
This is a country where deference played a very important part, and the young generation wanted to break with that, deferential attitude to authority, which was incredibly strong in Britain.
The fundamental idea behind all the thinkers that were then leapt into prominence was that the world is organized hierarchically, that there are powers that dominate. These powers are not necessarily explicit. Some of them are secret. We have to dig them out and repudiate them and claim our liberation from them. There is this bourgeois normality out there which is not the consensual good-natured thing that it pretends. It really is a system of domination, and we must side with the victims and liberate them. And I think that was this sort of general view that suddenly became popular among the highly pampered youth of the baby boom era.
Do you think that the middle class and the capitalists will give up easily or fight to the end?
They will fight tooth and nail until you can push off your oppressor. He will never give in, and that has to be through violence.
Young activists turned to One-Dimensional Man by the German philosopher Herbert Marcuse. It argued that consumerist society, for all its talk of freedom, actually stifled democracy and liberty. As a refugee from the Nazis, Marcuse had seen fascism firsthand when he developed a radical Marxist view of the repressiveness of the state. Marcuse was interviewed by the philosopher Brian McGee in the late 1970s, just a year before his death.
Professor Marcuse, why should it have been to your writings that the revolutionary student movements of the 1960s and early 70s turned?
The student generation that became active in these years did not need a father figure or a grandfather figure in order to lead them to protest against a society which revealed daily its inequality, injustice, cruelty, and its general destructiveness. I would like to mention racism, sexism, the general insecurity, the pollution of the environment, the degradation of education, the degradation of work, and so on and so on. In other words, what exploded in the 60s and early 70s was a blatant contrast between the tremendous available social wealth and its miserable, destructive, and wasteful use. Ho, ho! Ho, ho! Ho,
ho! One of the disciples of Marcuse was a media-savvy Marxist called Tariq Ali. He propagated revolutionary ideas to students through his newspaper, The Black Dwarf.
We believe that Parliament is completely immaterial and is hypocritical because it leads the people to believe that here is something which can help you when it's completely ineffective.
In the late 60s, Ali even smuggled a taste of rebellion into people's homes when he and a group of student radicals were given a platform during a live broadcast. Presented by an establishment figure, Robert Mackenzie.
It was the BBC's idea. It wasn't our idea. We would never have dreamt of it.
Spilled out from the universities.
Obviously, they hoped we made fools of ourselves, but they did it.
Most of us are in fact libertarian Marxists. We believe in all power to the Soviets. We believe that that slogan is not dated at all, that it has not been properly applied. We believe in the abolition of money. We believe in the appropriation of all private property. And we believe in a large mass of people in their respective jobs that they do. Well, it's just, these are the bare essentials.
Yes. But the students derailed the live broadcast by bursting into the socialist anthem, the Internationale, forcing the producers hastily to put the final credits up.
Well, the next scene after the camera switched off, everyone burst out laughing. Us that we'd done it, the camera crew's amazed and very friendly and supportive and shaking hands, and Bob Mackenzie saying, "You got away with it."
But it wasn't just university students who protested against the status quo. Their teachers also attacked the outmoded and old-fashioned institutions of state. Ralph Miliband was a Belgian academic who, like Marcuse, had fled the Nazis. Today, he's famous as the father of Ed and David Miliband. But in the 60s, he was well known as a Marxist thinker, lambasting the monarchy during this televised debate.
Dr. Miliband, do you agree that monarchy remains a valuable institution?
If you think a nation should sleepwalk through history into the future, if you think that deference is an important part of government, if you think social hierarchies ought to be preserved, well, in that case, you're bound to think that monarchy is a valuable institution. If you think, on the other hand, that democratic government entails a high degree of political rationality, then I think you would think not.
Ralph Miliband wrote a series of books heavily critical of what he saw as the bullying imperialism of the British state.
I think that my dad caught the mood for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think he was a very good teacher, both in person and in his writing, maybe because English wasn't his first language. Secondly, it was a time of great struggle, and it's not just the man, it's the moment. And so I think the writing that he was doing was on the issues of the time, because it was a time of great optimism in some ways, but also great fear.
One cause that really energized Miliband and the left in the 1960s was the Vietnam War. Miliband was horrified that Harold Wilson's Labour Party seemed to be colluding with the Americans during the conflict.
There is a civil war with, on one side, nationalist, socialist, communist, neutralist forces grouped in the National Liberation Front. And on the other side, there are the military men, the politicians, the landowners, the racketeers, and all the forces of property and privilege.
He thought it was misbegotten, unjust, and potentially disastrous for the world. And the justification for American intervention was very weak, and the further that it was likely to end in disaster.
If Mr. Wilson genuinely wants peace, the first thing he must do is to condemn American bombing.
The 60s generation fought to change not just politics, but also social attitudes. And one movement, feminism, was to transform the status of women in Britain.
When I was at 17, 18, 19, all I thought about was getting married and having children. I thought it was going to be the most fantastic thing in the world. But I suddenly realised that what was it that I was sort of dreaming about, because it hasn't come true. You know, I've got married, I've got kids, but the dream life isn't there. Oh, you cow.
In 1971, the American feminist Selma James made a film for the BBC which allowed ordinary British women to talk about their lives.
Like millions of women everywhere, I'm a typist. I'm a housewife, a mother, and I've been a factory worker. I am one of those people who have always listened to women, assuming that what they are is not necessarily what they can be.
I mean, in a house, you can't expect a man to do the washing. You can't expect him to make beds or anything like that, can you?
I didn't want to live like my mum and dad lived. My mum doing everything, my dad doing nothing.
It was my view that if you wanted to find out what was going on, you had to ask people, because they could tell you. And in fact, looking at the film today, I find that it is a very good spectrum of views.
We work an 8-hour day here. I'm going home now to do some shopping. I don't have dinner lunch. I have a cup of tea if I'm lucky. I come back to work, I do my work. Then I go home and do my housework, get the tea prepared. How on earth?
Working women have two jobs, the one they get paid for and the one they don't, the running of the home.
Well, I really felt and still feel that the fact that women take care of children almost exclusively is a punishment for us rather than the enjoyment that it should be, and it's certainly a punishment for men. Men are deprived of a great deal in this society because women are given these jobs of caring.
How much time do you spend with your children?
Well, very little actually, just probably one day per week, which is Sunday.
We feel very much that men should take a full role in bringing up the children and in running the household. What do you feel about that?
I don't agree with that at all.
Tell us why. Tell us why.
A man just can't do it.
Why?
He hasn't got the patience of a woman, the understanding.
Feminism transformed attitudes to issues like equal pay and sex discrimination. Not that the BBC always kept pace with this huge social change.
This is International Women's Day today, and you sent a male to interview me and a male cameraman. Where are your women cameramen at the BBC?
Feminism produced a thinker who shone on screen and had no fear of expressing her provocative views.
Germaine Greer, the radical feminist and author of the best-selling book, The Female Eunuch, is in Newsday's studio tonight. But first, this evening's news summary.
Was an unknown Australian academic, but she was to become internationally famous with the incendiary Female Eunuch, which argued that society made women into weak, subservient creatures.
I don't believe there's a feminist alive who wants to abolish femaleness. My whole argument has been since the very beginning that we don't know what it is. You have given us a disgusting idea of it, a mimsy, useless, pathetic idea of it, which makes even bad mothers.
Women were already sniffing the air, looking out the window, thinking, I'm not standing by this bloody sink a moment longer. I'm going to go for a walk without my hat. That's what happened. The women made the book. The book didn't make the women.
Such was the book's popularity, the BBC even commissioned Greer to narrate a film about her ideas.
As long as the energies of women are not properly exercised, their natures are degraded into feebleness and irritability. The greatest service a woman can render her community is to be happy. More and more women are finding the courage to follow their own objective and realize their own potential.
But while she was the most famous exponent of feminism, Germaine Greer had misgivings about the collective nature of the women's liberation movement.
What's the biggest lesson you've learned in the women's movement?
The biggest lesson that I've learned? Well, you must understand that I haven't been a part of an organised women's movement. This is not really because I object to it or anything, but because for various reasons it hasn't been possible for me. So really I'm still where I always was, of hanging about on the edges.
But is the lesson that a lot of women don't want the sort of liberation that you want? Has that surprised you?
Well, the thing is this, that I don't consider that my time would be well spent marching about the place sowing despair and disillusion. There's quite enough despair and disillusion there already.
I watched Germaine Greer on the television. She was often there. And I'm really amazed at how many perceptions there are, what clarity she had, and how articulate and precise she is about many things. But she has absolutely no sense of the society as a hierarchy. And she has no sense of a movement. And that's unfortunate because it means that she doesn't see a way out.
Feminism was from the beginning very doctrinaire and very prescriptive. You had to be the right kind of feminist. It was a bit like having the right kind of orgasm. And I mean, there were some people who would tell you that if you didn't decide that you were in future going to have sexual relations with women, then you weren't a real feminist at all.
But from the mid-1970s, the idealism and optimism that had characterized the post-war period was crumbling. The New Jerusalem was falling apart. It was all because Britain had once again hit economic hard times. BBC cameras captured food shortages, strikes.
If you go in, you're scabbing on us. The scab's a scab, as far as we're concerned.
Electricity cuts.
Well, we're virtually out of business while the power's off. We've got no light to work with. It affects us pretty drastically.
And inflation rocketed.
Well, I think there was a change in the intellectual climate because of the crisis, that the socialist model under both parties had got into difficulties, and we visibly weren't succeeding economically as a nation, and it was causing enormous stress for individual families. People were losing jobs, they weren't on decent incomes, it wasn't very pleasant.
There was a sort of kind of sense that Western civilization was breaking down. Specifically, Britain seemed to be a country in great decline. Everyone started noticing that Britain had become the sick man of Europe. And people thought that must be something to do with the way it runs its economics and politics.
In this time of crisis, one thinker had a startling message. British economic policy since the Second World War was completely wrong. The Austrian-born academic Friedrich Hayek had been ignored, even vilified for most of his career, because of his heretical belief that the free market should be left to its own devices.
I have, incidentally, often regretted that there haven't been more bankruptcies in the past. I think British economy would be in a better position now if more firms had been eliminated, not being artificially kept alive.
But in the 70s, Hayek broke out of his ivory tower. His anti-government polemic, The Road to Serfdom, first published in 1944, even became a surprise bestseller.
Prosperity has never been created by governments. The most government can do is not disturb the prospects by interfering sillily in things which they do not understand.
I think the big idea from Hayek was this idea that a well-intentioned state doing more and more can end up suppressing freedoms, achieving the opposite of what it sets out to achieve, destroying wealth, prosperity, jobs, happiness, all those things that politicians ought to be in favour of.
He's got an arresting thesis. I mean, his thesis is that a market outcome is by definition just because it's been freely entered into. Now, that is a very pure description of what it means to be on the right of politics, because it says that market exchange, because it's quote-unquote free, is necessarily fair.
So far as commercial activities or economic activities are concerned, we will benefit our fellow men most if we are guided solely by the striving for gain.
Isn't it a philosophy based essentially on selfishness? That is to say, the only spur, it seems, is gain. What about altruism? Where does that come in?
It doesn't come in.
Hayek's high-minded philosophy was given concrete form by a plain-talking economist from Chicago who was a broadcasting natural. Milton Friedman.
Professor Friedman, you've just written in an article, and I quote you, "The odds are at least 50-50 that within the next 5 years, British freedom and democracy will have been destroyed." How do you reach that, to British ears, terrifying and apocalyptic conclusion?
It's a terrifying conclusion to myself and to American ears. I certainly hope you don't continue down that road, but a candid man must find it hard to see how you're going to get off it.
Up with a theory of how to solve Britain's economic woes: monetarism. Friedman said Keynes was wrong. Governments should spend less and print less money in difficult times, taking money out of circulation to combat rising prices.
Turning off the tap, reducing the flow of money and spending power in the economy, now has the highest priority. The economic theory behind this trend has come to be known as monetarism.
There is only one way to cure inflation. There aren't any two ways. The only way to cure inflation is to slow down the rate at which the quantity of money is increasing.
Friedman had a very powerful argument. I think there were bits of it that are wrong and which didn't survive, but at that moment people said, well, he's given us a way of governing again.
Friedman made his theories sound like common sense, but they were highly controversial. Critics said reducing spending would throw millions of people out of work.
Unfortunately, when you have followed policies as misguided as British policies have been these many years, there is no way out that is going to be easy and costless.
Are you saying that means that we have to accept a higher level of unemployment, whatever happens?
I am afraid that that is likely to be the case.
In terms of emotion, I think the Keynesians of that day, and this was right at the end of the Keynesian era, when they were really on the defensive, thought that Milton Friedman was the embodiment of evil, that he wanted to put the clock back to the 1930s.
I have argued for a long while that monetarism, a set of ideas that come from Professor Milton Friedman in modern times, I have argued that this is not an issue between left and right, conservatives and labor, liberals and conservatives. The issue is whether it works or not. Mm-hmm. And I've long argued that it doesn't work.
This fight between Friedman and the Keynesians reached its climax on television. In 1976, the BBC travelled to Chicago to film a Labour minister confronting Friedman on a hot-tempered episode of Panorama.
We took a distinguished British economist, very much committed to recent British policies, Lord Ballard, to challenge Milton Friedman on his home ground. Professor Friedman, you've made some very dire predictions about Britain. Can you just explain, first of all, what it is that you think ought to be happening in Britain that isn't happening?
There is nothing, in my opinion, wrong with Britain that could not be set right by a change in the direction of your policy away from a policy which leads to putting civil servants in charge of everything to a policy which gives to the ordinary man control over his own life.
His policies have never succeeded. Wherever it was tried, either in America or in England, a political economist, and he is, after all, a very political economist, must take into account the probable consequences politically and socially of his advice, and this he is quite incapable of doing.
What do you believe those to be?
Total collapse of the consensus which we had, probably a strike and the decline of the country, with absolutely incalculable consequences.
What do you say to that?
Well, I say that continued increase in government spending has produced exactly the results that he said the opposite would produce. After all, you've had an increased growth in government spending, you've had increased militancy in the unions, and you've had increased unemployment. So apparently, Mr. Balog
again, I mean, Professor Friedman, entirely wrong.
I don't mean to be invidious on that. I'm just saying. I'm not saying that the trade unions are robbers. I don't mean to say that.
Now come the weasel word.
Can I put you a quote from a London newspaper, The Guardian, this week, which said you were a cantankerous old bigot, peddling your patent wonder cure and telling the world that those who decline to take your wonder cure will die a very nasty death.
Wonder cure was to be taken up by an eager patient who was to use the BBC to make monetarism palatable to a British audience. An Oxford Don and conservative intellectual, Keith Joseph.
I thought I was a conservative. I thought I was a conservative. But all the time I was in favor of shortcuts to utopia. I was in favor of the government doing things because I was so impatient for good things to be done. And I didn't realize that the government generally makes a mess. Do you see? The more ministers try to do, the less well they do it.
It was Karl Marx who has done more to alter the world, I say for ill.
Joseph was committed to spreading a new right-wing gospel of personal responsibility over state intervention.
And how did he have the time to write his work?
Even preaching his message to roomfuls of bemused-looking students.
He was supported for 30 years of scholarship.
This country is conservative with a small c. That's to say, it doesn't believe in collective solutions. It cherishes freedom, and yet we have allowed this rubber stamp of collectivism that has been propagated by socialist intellectuals to dominate our lives. And the result is, as I've said before, we're now more socialist than any other developed country.
There's still a little bit sticking up there. You can see it in the reflection.
Joseph was the key advisor to the party's first female leader, Margaret Thatcher, who made speeches that tore apart the old consensus politics of the post-war period.
Will bring in a society which lives within its means, where public expenditure is cut, and where waste of taxpayers' money is ruthlessly expunged. Yes, we'll bring in a conservative society.
And when Thatcher won the 1979 election, the ideas of Hayek and Friedman were now at the heart of British government.
The Thatcher government is a kind of an experiment in whether it will be possible in a democratic society that has gone as far as Britain has gone to change course in an orderly, effective way to set Britain on a new road. If the Thatcher government succeeds, it will be an example that will not be lost on the United States or the rest of the world.
Under the Conservatives, the government tried to curb spending. It privatized many of the industries that it owned to encourage free enterprise. The stock market was deregulated, generating billions of pounds of revenue. But as the Keynesians predicted, strikes became increasingly embittered and joblessness soared to rates not seen since the 1930s.
Unemployment in Britain is now 2.5 million and rising. Monetarists always said that unemployment was the unavoidable price for cutting inflation, but no one expected Britain's recession to be so severe or so long-lived.
By the end of the 80s, free market values seemed to have triumphed both in West and Eastern Europe.
They've opened the floodgates, and here at Checkpoint Charlie and other gaping holes in the wall, a great human tide is flowing out. They're pouring through here by car and on foot to spend an hour, a day, as long as they please in the West.
In 1989, the communist system collapsed across Eastern Europe. Capitalism appeared to have won. And one philosopher preached that the ideological battles of the modern age were now over. A provocative New York academic, Francis Fukuyama, became a celebrity with the last big idea of the century. Liberal capitalist democracy, championed by Thatcher in Britain and Reagan in America, was so suited to human needs, we'd reached the end of history.
In 1989, an unknown researcher at an American think tank wrote an article for an obscure foreign policy journal. But this article was called The End of History. In it, Francis Fukuyama argued that the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War had left capitalism and liberal democracy without any challengers.
It seems to me what you've seen happening in this century. When we began it, there were many competitors to liberal democracy, leftover hereditary monarchies, fascist dictatorships, communist totalitarianism, and virtually all of those major competitors have now disappeared by the end of the 20th century.
What people wanted to hear was that the West had won, that what were described as our values would now spread not only throughout the former Soviet Union and in Russia, which they didn't, certainly not in Russia, not for long at any rate, but also in China and throughout the entire world.
It seems to me that liberal democracy in the end is the best arrangement of politics by which people can be recognized on a kind of universal and rational basis. And that ultimately accounts for the fact that I think communism collapsed because it did not recognize everyday person's dignity.
Okay. Every single word raises controversial issues.
Sure. That vision of democratic capitalism spreading everywhere carried with it the promise of permanent peace, steady economic growth, the disappearance of war, and the gradual vanishing of intractable human conflicts. They are all illusions, but they're the sort of illusions that are perennially attractive.
Fukuyama's predictions, it seems hard to believe that we now live at the end of history. Cultural and ideological clashes haven't disappeared. The financial world is no more predictable than it's ever been. Thinkers use broadcasting to try to change the world. But it seems unlikely that the battle of ideas, the grand experiments, are likely to end anytime soon.